In today's session, we'll discuss not so much the physical threats to journalists, rather the threats to journalism itself, from censorship and national security pressures to the commercial changes that have decimated newsrooms around the world. The media industry has experienced massive turbulent changes in recent years. At the turn of the millennium, Fairfax shares were worth $6. Today, they're worth less than $1. In 2004, barely 11 years ago, its executives refused even to contemplate that the Saturday Age wouldn't be the home of classified ads for Melburnians. Though only a few years ago, it was a different world. Julian Assange was still a student at Melbourne University. Facebook didn't even exist in early 2004. The first iPhone didn't appear until 2007. Since then, the technological rate of change has, if anything, sped up, with unforeseeable effects on the whole media landscape. Wikileaks became an international sensation in 2010. Edward Snowden turned the national security and global surveillance debate upside down in 2013. And newspaper circulation has been falling all this time. Its proprietors yet to find a new business model that works. It's become a cliche by now, but it's still true that the print advertising dollars became digital cents. Amid these tectonic shifts, it's hardly surprising that journalism itself is under threat. Our guest today, Andrew Fowler, has seen these changes and their effects up close. Andrew is an investigative journalist and the author of The Most Dangerous Man in the World, The Story of Wikileaks and Julian Assange, and now The War on Journalism. Between 1996 and 2013, he was a reporter for ABC's Four Corners and Foreign Correspondent programs and headed up the ABC's investigative unit. He's also a former acting foreign editor and chief of staff of the Australian newspaper and has worked for SBS Dateline and Channel 7. In The War on Journalism, Andrew argues the mainstream media is in crisis. Racked by public distrust, cowed by government surveillance and powerful corporations, newspapers which flourished for centuries and TV networks that once ruled the world are failing. This afternoon, he's going to talk about why and what might be done about it. And afterwards, we'll have a chance to put some questions to him. Please welcome Andrew Fowler.
Thank you very much. I wanted to start by telling you what happened to us the other day. We went to Canberra, and I went back to one of my old haunts, what's known now as Old Parliament House, or it's what I call Old Parliament House, which means that there's a new Parliament House, but apparently the new Parliament House has been there for about 25 years or so, which just goes to show you how long ago I worked in Canberra. And while I was there, I noticed that the corridors in what's now the museum are very, very small in Old Parliament House. And that the journalists, I remember, and the politicians were very, very close, cheek by jowl, you might say, at times. And when I went up to the new Parliament House, the large, spacious one that opened in 1988, of course, it's a massive place. The corridors are as wide as the corridors in the Macquarie Bank. I mean, they're massive. And it struck me that during that period of time, what's happened is, although the politicians and the journalists are further apart now, physically, than they were in the old Parliament House, they're actually much, much closer together. The relationship between journalists and politicians has never been more closer. And the reason for that is because there's a need mainly by the politicians to get their message out, but just as much by the journalists to fill the gaps that exist in their newsrooms, in their online presence, and in their television stations. That's the gaps in the information that they broadcast and publish to their audience and to their readers. Now, the reason that there's a problem of that magnitude, and the reason that the government can take such advantage of this and put material out which virtually goes to air uncensored and unquestioned, is because of the lack of staff. Why is there a lack of staff? Because we know that the number of readers and the number of viewers of television stations has fallen, and as they've fallen, so too have the classified ads and the ads that appear on television. So has the revenue. And they were once famously called the rivers of gold. These were the classified advertisements that paid for the wages of people like me to do my job. And now they've dried up, and some might say that they've turned into rivers of blood for journalists because so many of us have lost their jobs, reducing the number of journalists that are able to hold the government to account. Now, you might say, so what? I mean, what is the role of journalism? Journalists, just a bunch of snake oil salesmen who will sell their own grandmother for maybe 3 and sixpence or whatever it is. But really, the role of journalism, it may have those characters in it, and it certainly does, and it certainly has, and it certainly will be as long as journalism exists. But the fundamental ideal of journalism is, I think, encapsulated in the phrase, the fourth estate. Now, we very often use the word, the fourth estate, that's right, the fourth estate, casually, and when you look at really where it came from the notion that the church and the law lords and the commons in Britain were separate entities. And the idea was that the fourth estate would hold the other three to account. Now, in a democratic world, with an increasingly powerful executive, an increasingly difficult world and complex world to live in, with an increasingly strident executive, it's more important than ever that we actually have a vibrant, strong, courageous fourth estate. And I'll lay to rest one of the great lies that's told repeatedly about journalism, and it is that money isn't that important. Money is the most important thing for independence. Without money, journalists can't be independent. Without money, corporations that publish newspapers can't be independent. And the reason that newspaper journalism particularly is important, although radio and television is also important, newspapers have always been the intellectual heart of journalism. And that, it isn't necessarily true of some newspapers, some papers like the Old Truth in Melbourne or the Old Daily Mirror in Sydney, but it's certainly true of the broad brush of mass circulation newspapers. I think it's really important to remember that when those newspapers fail, as they do, and as they are now, and we're watching them, you can watch the spiral, as Nick pointed out earlier, the spiral of the newspaper circulation going down and the money going with it. And that's, I think 10 years ago, Sydney Morning Herald would have got $40,000 for one page of classified ads. Count the classified ads in the Sydney Morning Herald or the Melbourne Age today, and you'll see how much money they've lost. Now, I would have thought that journalists and people that are involved in the media of being courageous and telling the world the truth, the ugly truth about themselves, may well have had a moment of reflection and said, there's a bit of an issue here, we're very important, we know we're very important, we know we have a very important role to play in society. Do you think we should maybe tell the readers what a diabolical state we're in? Should we do this? Well, the answer was categorically that they didn't do that. Neither Fairfax nor News Corp did that. In fact, they did just the opposite. They blatantly lied about their circumstances. They said that the future of journalism had never been better, that there was a shiny new models of journalism just around the corner and everything was going to be fine, and all this nonsense about journalism being in decline was nonsense, was absolute rubbish, and carry on. Now, I think, having made those statements, if I'd been in charge of any, if I had any power at all, I would have asked the maybe Corporate Affairs Commission or the police or someone to have investigated this, because they were misleading their shareholders, and they were certainly misleading the people who saw a future in journalism in their newspapers. It just didn't happen. In fact, the whole thing just continued its spiral, and we end up where we are today. One of the fundamentals of controlling this kind of problem, as I say, is to be deceptive. What happens as a result of that is that governments know the truth. They know that you are on Skid Row. So when they want to control you, there's no better way to do that, no better way to lay a blow on you than in a very crucial matter of national importance. And there's nothing more important in the national sphere of politics than a war. So when the Iraq War was in its nascence, when it was just before it really got off the ground as an issue in the United States, there were these various notions of what might be done about Iraq and whether or not Iraq could have its regime changed by presidential fiat, which went back to George W. Bush and then Clinton, George Bush Senior, Clinton, and then George W. Bush. So this was always in the background. Now, when you then have the Twin Towers attack, there's no better time to control the purveyors of information than at that time. And it was then that the notion of the war on terror was born. And it actually came out of a Tom Brokaw NBC American presenter who mentioned the fact that America was at war, and or that said that the terrorists were at war with America, and it was turned around by Bush into the war on terror. Now, once you have a war, even journalists who are given to not care much about rules and regulations generally tend to pull their head in. They toe the line. What happens as a result of what I'm going to tell you about, you may know this story, you may not, is quite chilling, and it involves an American journalist by the name of Judith Miller and an ABC reporter called Paul Moran. What happened is that the United States Pentagon that was running this particular war, the previous one had been run by the CIA, that was the first Gulf War, this was the second one. They employed a group called the Rendon Group. It's an American lobbyist group. It was involved in spreading a lot of disinformation about in the first Gulf War, and they were hired by the CIA. Now, the CIA caught them fiddling the books, and so when the second Gulf War came around, they didn't use them. But the Pentagon picked them up, and with them, they picked up what went with the first war, which was a group called the Iraqi National Congress. The Iraqi National Congress had a great interest in ousting Saddam Hussein, and the Rendon Group had a great interest in ousting Saddam Hussein under direction from the president. So they managed to concoct a story through a guy called al-Hadiri, and this guy told a lot of funny stories, but they were kind of plausible, but nobody checked them out, and no one did bother to check them out. They leaked these stories to Judith Miller, and she published them on the front page of the New York Times. They also arranged for an interview between this guy Hadiri and Paul Moran, who was a freelance working for the ABC. Now, Moran broadcast his story on the ABC. It went around the world, became the television version of the notion that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. And Judith Miller did the same thing in the New York Times. So these two pieces of information, they were completely fraudulent and known to be so because just after these two people had carried out their interview with Hadiri, the CIA put a lie detector test on Hadiri, and we now know that the CIA reported back this guy was a complete and utter fraud and a flake. That didn't stop the New York Times or the ABC from running these stories. The ABC, because they said they were in the dark and they believed the story that they were told, and Judith Miller, because her contacts apparently that went all the way to the White House didn't actually go to show that she might have got something wrong. This kind of capture that occurs is not a one-off event. It happens every single day of a journalist's life. It doesn't matter quite as much when you're maybe doing a smaller story. When you're involved in a war, I think it's the most significant issue and something that we need to watch very carefully. Because what happens as a result of the mistrust that people then place in news organisations is that those people that are watching the war unfold, and they're inside the intelligence and military organisations, like Bradley Manning was, now Chelsea Manning. She saw what was going on in Iraq. She understood the truth, and she took action to put that wrong right. What did she do? She called the Washington Post, and said, "I've got a story." They logged it, but didn't respond because they weren't interested in people outside the group. This was some idiot calling from outside, wasn't one of our usual informers, not interested. So this person, as an outsider, was shut out from the inside. Eventually, Manning went to Assange, and Assange, as we now know the story of what happened to Julian, he then went through the process of dealing with The Guardian, and that was fraught with a number of problems, but eventually the story was out and we learnt the truth. I think that what the intelligence agencies hoped and what the governments, America and Australia, hoped was that Assange would go away and that locking Manning up for 35 years might silence everybody and cower everybody. But it didn't. What happened is that there was a guy called Edward Snowden who also was sick and tired of reading the nonsense he was reading in the New York Times and other newspapers syndicated around the world, and watching the kind of stuff that we put to air in the name of public broadcasting. And he was very angry about one thing in particular, and it was a breach of the Fourth Amendment of the United States, which is an amendment of the United States Constitution which says that you cannot randomly search anybody. He thought that constitutional matter had been breached by the NSA, the National Security Agency, where he was working. But he decided specifically not to contact the New York Times. Imagine, he's got the story of, I think, journalistic history. He doesn't call the paper, Pentagon Papers, great revelations down the ages, number of stories, big stories, Pulitzer Prize winning. They couldn't build a cabinet big enough to put all the Pulitzer Prizes in it. The New York Times has won. Didn't call them. Instead, there's a bloke called Glenn Greenwald who was down there in Brazil, and he was blogging, and he was supporting Julian Assange when Assange was under attack, not just from the intelligence agencies and the governments, conservative governments. He's under attack from journalists, under attack from the New York Times, who were saying Assange is not a journalist. Assange is not covered by the First Amendment, which gives you limited protection of freedom of speech as a journalist. This was Bill Keller, who was the editor of the New York Times. So Assange is now cast adrift, where, fearful that if he went to the United States, he would have no defense of the First Amendment. What you then have is Assange, under attack not only from the government, but I think more significantly, and I think in retrospect, even more significantly than the government, under attack from journalists who accused him of being a traitor, who accused him of risking people's lives, and accused him of treachery. Even in this country, the Prime Minister accused him of being a traitor. Certainly, senior people in the administration accused him of doing traitorous things. Traitor to whom? I asked the question. And who was hurt? Nobody was hurt in the release of all those documents by WikiLeaks. One person was killed, reported in the Times of London, Rupert Murdoch's newspaper. If anyone's going to find someone who's dead as a result of a leak on national security, provided it doesn't affect Rupert's business model, it'll be it'll be the Murdoch stable. The trouble is, the person they found who was dead died 2 years ago, 2 years earlier, so they had to issue a correction. But these kind of assaults were going on all the time. Now, the guy that was standing up to them was Glenn Greenwald, and he wasn't part of the inner group. He wasn't part of the cosy circle who fed off the press releases and the rest of it. He was just in there as a former lawyer, just giving them heaps, just writing this extraordinarily detailed and concise analysis and criticism of the way that WikiLeaks was being hounded. So Snowden thought, looks like the man for me. I'll give him a call. So that's what he did. He contacted Glenn Greenwald, and together they worked and put together those extraordinary stories which changed the way we behave. Or at least I hope it changed the way that we behave, because he told us that everything is public now. Every mobile phone you've got is tracking you, whether or not you've got it turned on location services or off or whatever. Every time you pass a mobile phone tower, it registers, it clicks you, it sends a signal out in the phone, it's saved by your telco company, and you cross-reference, you can see who's sitting next to whom at these kind of conferences, whether you went home that night, whether you went to the hotel, or what you did with your life is there as a matrix, and that's just open material for any agency to look at, and that's what he told us. What he also told us is that we should all use some kind of encryption system when we write emails, and that's if you're a doctor, a dentist, a lawyer, a journalist, and anything. The rest of the world, other journalists in the other parts of the world, use this kind of system, which is called Pretty Good Privacy, and you can download it, and it's a bit complicated, but it's worth doing because it means that you can write stuff without other people knowing it. It's like writing a letter in the old days, putting it in an envelope, as opposed to having a postcard that the postman can read. I mean, it's not that you're doing anything wrong, it's just that as human beings, we have a right to privacy. We have a right to our own private lives. And that's one of the things I think that he really taught us. I think that, when you look at the kind of words that were used to attack Assange, and you look at the way that the war on terrorism was used as a overarching way to control the entire community, and particularly the journalists, you then got to look at the way in which this new war on journalism, which is that's the title of the book, by the way, The War on Journalism, is actually affecting our lives as journalists. And journalists will tell you repeatedly that they do great work and they're courageous and the rest of it, but they also don't use the fundamental skills that I just told you about, simple things like using an encrypted email system. And the government is very much aware of that. In fact, the government is very keen to control journalists and to if they're not looking at your profile of who you meet and who you speak to, then they're just trying to stand over you and your organizations to stop you from challenging them. So it's like a psychological war. Not just is it a matter of investigating your information, picking up your metadata, which are the little bits of information that show which email you sent, when you sent it, and the rest of it. It's actually about intimidation and control. And so if you work inside an organization and the government's just introduced some really sort of wide-reaching legislative material, and you're doing a story which looks at these kind of issues, then there's not exactly going to be a whoop of joy from the editor's office. And not exactly, I mean, they will do it, but there's a real fear again. And ever since I've left the ABC 3 or 4 years ago, it's actually there's a hesitancy. There was when I was there. Did I say 3 or 4? It's only 18 months. It seems like 5 years. Sorry, 18 months ago. There's a hesitancy because of the the trouble that you can cause and cause the administration, not just to be locked up for 5 years, but actually just dealing with the complaint system at the ABC. The ABC has a complaint system that would take too long to explain, but it lasts forever and a day. And it is the most scrutinised organisation I've ever seen in my life. It's absolutely extraordinary. I've lived through it for 20 years. There were complaints about a story I did about Julian Assange, which lasted 3 months after I left the organisation. I was still answering questions about this particular complaint. And we won the case, and it was great because we could say to all the people that were wishing us harm that we had won, an independent view had been given, and we were right. But I suppose what I'm talking about is that this is all about just control. One way or the other, they try to control you. As Peter Grest, who is a journalist who has done heroic things, there's no doubt about what Peter Grest has done. He's now, as you know, out of jail, came to the National Press Club in Canberra. And he spoke about the problems facing journalism. And he was standing more or less like I am now talking to you. And he said, "It's great to be out. Thanks very much." And Julie Bishop was in the audience and was smiling, nice camera shot of Julie smiling, waving. And he said, "You know, the trouble is, journalists can get far too close to politicians. There's a real danger in this," he said. He said, "what we have is, we have almost like a sliding scale, and it goes from 0 to 1. It's either going in one direction or the other. One way is towards transparency and more accountability, and the other way is towards more authoritarianism or towards authoritarianism." And he suggested that this was the way in which we were travelling. And the looks on the faces of my old comrades in arms in Canberra as they saw Grester, who was untouchable and was a journalistic hero, telling them of the dangers that they faced by getting too close to the government and being basically not patsies for what the government does, but not holding the government to account and in danger of being captured by their sources. The blood was draining from their faces. They looked none too happy to hear this kind of news. Now, it's not true to say that all journalists are like that. I mean, many of them do really good work. You've got the Age newspaper here that occasionally does fabulous stories, great investigatory stuff, Nick Mackenzie and Richard Baker, those kind of people. But this is not the way that journalism should be. Journalism should be an ongoing pursuit of truth, not just a one-off hit to make it look not to make it look, but that actually reinforces the fact that you do care. People do care about investigations, they do. But journalism in itself is an investigation. Journalism in itself has been famously said to be everything that somebody wants known is public relations. All else is news. So if you want to hide stuff, it's news. If you want it out there, it's PR. And it's more or less true. Not exactly. I mean, I do understand you have to listen to the Prime Minister speak and allow him to have, his 30 seconds and whatever. I understand that kind of he said, she said journalism, as we call it. But really, the pursuit of information is to disclose what others want kept secret, particularly people who are in government. I mean, particularly people in large corporations, and I kind of put them almost on the same par. One of the major problems we have in Australia is that we have, 22 million people, and we have one of the most, if not the most powerful media magnate the world's ever produced in producing newspapers in this country. And Murdoch he's an ideologue up to a point. He's mainly just a very aggressive, mercantile practitioner. He's in it for a quid, and he's in it for the power it brings him. And this person, who's been described by some as a rogue, can terrify people into doing what he wants. Now, this is a very large person looming in this kind of quite a small country that's got a withering fourth estate. It's got a broken model. It's got, there's no money. There are fewer journalists. The executive of the government are standing over the journalists and proprietors. Proprietors have been lying about how bad it is. We all know how bad it is. And Murdoch's in here with a big bag of cash, $20 million a year they lose, the Australian, I understand. And even though their circulation goes down, and now I think they're giving away iPads as well if you want to read the Australian online. And you ask the question, well, why is this? What is this about? Why is this organisation spending so much money supporting a newspaper that's read by so few people? And many of the newspapers that are read by the Australian are read for free as well, if they read them at all. You see them, stacks of them at the airports and where have you. And it's because it gives a feeling in the community that the paper is recognised as a newspaper. And yet, really, it's nothing more than a propaganda sheet for a person who is running a campaign, in my opinion, to clear fell the commercial opposition as it stumbles around in the wilderness, because they don't have bags of cash like Rupert's got, right? So this is where we now sit, where we've got a rather powerful executive government. We've got journalists there aren't enough journalists to provide information to feed the beast. That is their job, is their work. You've got the internet feeding off what's left of the carcass, providing information, because not much new material is being produced. A lot of it's commentary. So the withering heart of the Fourth Estate is being eaten away by the internet as well. So it's really being attacked by just about everybody. And the question is, in a democracy, what do we do about this? How do we get into this brave new world, wherever it comes, this place that will hopefully be better? And why is it important? Well, the second point first, and that is it's important because without a vibrant Fourth Estate championing truth, information, and holding power to account, you are in danger of losing your democracy. Of course, we say, well, this is Australia, has this guy been on the moon for the last 50 years? And I just look at the history of things, and I look at what happened in the United States when Richard Nixon was in trouble. And this was an analog age. He had to send goons into the Watergate complex, and they botched it. You haven't got to do that anymore. The control systems are completely there. Now, this isn't a conspiracy. This is just a straightforward matter of fact. I'm not saying that Tony Abbott's going to throw the switch to lock up the entire population, but these are the dangers that we face, right? So the question is, how do we get from this rather muddled, burnt-out wreck of the old Fourth Estate into the brand new world? And the thing that stands in the way is not only Rupert Murdoch. The thing that actually is in the middle is the ABC. The ABC is a broad mass producer of information for the entire community. You don't click on one. You can now, of course, but you can't necessarily click on one narrow channel of bigotry in that, or this particular area that interests you, or that area. You can, if you watch the ABC or listen to the ABC, be exposed to a multiplicity of different ideas. And that was the genuine strength that newspapers, despite their political differences, brought to the population. They exposed many people to ideas that they would never have thought about. Today, we can click to our prejudice and avoid any kind of discussion with anybody else who doesn't agree with us. The ABC provides that last sort of broad, it's what it's called, a broadcaster, a broad reportage of the whole of Australia. That's why the ABC is important. And the reason that Rupert Murdoch wants it dead is because it stands in the way of his readership and viewership model that encompasses mainly A-B readers. Those are the wealthy people, people that, the elites, if you like, to use Paul Keating's expression, those people who Murdoch wants to read his paper. So it's not so much about ideology, although I think it plays a bit of a role, but the attack on the ABC is about commercial interests and about clearing out the opposition. So here's the point. The ABC is underfunded, would be an understatement. The ABC, compared to the BBC, which is also under attack from Rupert Murdoch in the United Kingdom, is funded 6 times less per head of population and per task carried out, according to a research document that was published probably 10 years ago now, so it may be even worse for the ABC. And you have to ask the question, well, if that's the case, how does the ABC save itself from itself? How does it actually manage to survive as we use it to carry ourselves from the old Fourth Estate into the brand new world? Because this could be the bridge that does it for you. Well, it needs funding and it needs support. And unfortunately, at the moment, the ABC doesn't have the funding and it doesn't have the support from the people who should be supporting it. And these people they're not against the ABC. In fact, they represent the ABC. The MD, Mark Scott, good, honourable person, stands up for things that are right, has done a good job, saved us from the wreckage of Jonathan Shire. I mean, that's too long to go into, but that was a malevolent act of absolute bastardry against the ABC. I was there. It was horrible. And the echo of the fear of that kind of thing coming back haunts the building to this day, that when Mark Scott leaves, we're going to have another Jonathan Shire on our hands, particularly if the present government is re-elected. So there's a real concern. People get a bit shell-shocked by it because they've got houses and jobs and kids, and also they care about their journalism. Why is it that the chairman of the board, a noted jurist, Jim Spiegelman, applauded by all, doesn't stand up and tell the government to get the hell out of the ABC? Why does he have rolling reviews of every program that goes to air, where it can be examined and held, and the reporters can be questioned about whether or not they should have asked this question or that question? Have you any idea what it's like to be working in an environment? I mean, I certainly don't, because I didn't have to put up with it. I had strong leadership that said, you go out and do your job. We know you're going to get it wrong, but whatever it is, we know that you're doing your best. We'll stand by you. Without that, you may be second-guessing what the guy is going to say in the morning, How did they go last night? I mean, well, I don't know. Maybe it was all right. Maybe it wasn't all right. Maybe I shouldn't be so strident. Maybe I should be this. I want to get that job in Washington. I want to do that job. If I get marks against me, how will it look on my CV? All of this. It is debilitating for the thing that stands between the old, crumbled Fourth Estate and the new model, whatever that is. So it sounds like a bit of special pleading, because that's where I used to work, but I have had problems with the ABC. Everybody does that works inside an organisation. But I've got to tell you that the hearts of journalism in the ABC, and obviously parts of the Age, Fairfax, and the Guardian, and those kind of papers, I mean, they're there. But the institution which covers the whole of Australia, that covers the masses, and that's the business. It's not like the Monthly, a great magazine, wonderful. But you need to educate, you need to inform the masses of Australia. That's why you need the mass media. And when it's in the state it's in at the moment, Australia is in a bad state, particularly in a country that has, you have compulsory voting. We have compulsory voting. You must vote. If you must vote, but you're not informed, what might happen with that vote? We're at a really crazy crossover point in this country at the moment. It's a very small population with a very powerful demagogic proprietor of a newspaper that's quite influential in this country, and I'm concerned about it. But there is some hope, and I think the ABC is part of that. I would suggest also, and I was talking to ABC, no, it wasn't ABC, actually commercial radio interviewer in Adelaide, and he said, look, this is all, doom and gloom, and I said, well, yes, it is, you're quite right, yes, it is, and but maybe there's a way of giving some kind of status to newspapers which helps them survive, which actually provides some sort of financial support for newspapers. Now I raise this with, sort of because it sounds like, well, it's like welfare for industry. But this is not just any old industry. We're not looking for a new business model to save democracy, are we? Are we turning to business? Is it business that will save us? I don't think so. I mean, business took us to the edge of this bloody abyss, which terrified the life out of me and everybody I know. It was a terrible thing. So I think that we've got to when we're looking for a new model, we're looking for a new model. We're not looking for a new business model. That way, it allows you to think in other ways, as opposed to always being just a commercial consideration, because although commerce is important, this is, I think, more important than commerce. It's to do with saving the very democracy that we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. I had a question. Reading your book, you place a lot of emphasis on the work of just this handful of insiders, Edward Snowden and Assange in particular, and because of the likes of Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, we know about their work. And if an Edward Snowden appeared today in Australia with a cache of secret documents, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Where would you advise them to go?
I'd advise them to go to a journalist they trust.
Sorry? A
journalist they trust. I wouldn't advise them to go to an organisation. Never go to an organisation. Never. Only go to an individual. It's like going to the Liberal Party or the Labour Party. It doesn't exist. It exists as a group, but it's a wide and varied group, as we know. So you need to do your homework and go to the people you can trust. Maybe the Monthly.
Maybe, please, if you're out there. I'm going to open it up for questions, so if you have one, please raise your hand, and there's a roving microphone. There's a couple here. I'll just ask, I've just got another one. We've seen the slow creep of government-mandated secrecy in Australia on issues like on water matters, on offshore detention, on the reporting of intelligence operations.
Yeah.
Do you think there should be a sort of, is it possible to have a kind of collective response from media organisations to this? Do you think the media needs to act collectively to respond to these things?
Well, the problem you have is that organisations like the Australian, they preach free speech, but when it comes to revealing information like Snowden revealed, he's condemned as a traitor and a terrorist, and Assange too, on and off. So I really don't know how to deal with that, except to say that, if you've got an oppressive government that wants to control the media, well, what's new about that? How do you get journalists to agree on anything? Well, that's another story, because they're completely they're anarchists, and to put it mildly, anarchistic tendencies anyway. But I would have thought that self-interest would have prevailed, and that newspapers would stand up, as they did generally, about the oppressive nature of these laws. But let's get it straight. What they stood up for was themselves, and not for the people that risked all to bring the information out. And we focus so much as journalists upon journalists being protected. The data retention laws, wonderful stuff. You have to have a warrant to get my data. You have to, whereas you guys, they can get your data without having to ask anybody. Whereas I'm protected. But you're the people that are going to reveal the information to me. I'm the journalist. Why am I protected and you're not? And this argument just seems to disappear, because journalists, I suppose, develop the argument and it protects them. I would have thought whistleblower protection is what you really need. If you protect the whistleblowers, you've protected the journalists.
Yeah. I had a period... Was there a question just here? Well, yeah. I was just saying, I had a period earlier this year where I had 4 people on the phone saying that they couldn't talk on the phone. You know, we couldn't. The Snowden and Assange revelations have had quite a chilling effect on public debate now. People are so aware of their rights being infringed that it's very hard to get people to talk about anything anymore. It's a strange kind of inverse effect to what's happened. There's a question here, sir.
I just wanted to ask, with regards to the ABC program Q&A being reclassified as news as opposed to entertainment, how does that change the game? What's the point? Who's behind it?
Well, look, I'm not across the exact details, but what I can tell you is that Q&A falls into the news editorial guidelines. It's covered by the existing rules and regulations that cover all of news and current affairs. So shifting it into news and current affairs out of entertainment is a pointless exercise, except one thing. It tells the government you're prepared to save their face, and it sends a chilling message to people who work in the organisation who say they've buckled again. And that's the problem. And believe it or not, journalists watch very closely those kind of things. They are, they're students of nuance, and we see those things and they're clumsy attempts just to, I think, intimidate. And when the government tries to intimidate and the board allows it to happen or is actually complicit in it, you expect it when you have a board loaded with people who seem to be opposed to public broadcasting and disclosure. You don't expect to see it from a board we have at the moment. But what they then fear is, and that's bad enough, the next thing is what happens next when Kevin Rudd set up a cutout to allow the board, not to be stacked. It was an attempt not to stop the board being stacked, because every government, when they got in, in dictatorships, they surround the broadcaster with tanks and take over the place. At the ABC, they just try and stack the board, right? So what Rudd did was to put a cutout in, and he said the head of PM&C or public service will appoint 2 people who will be on a 4-person panel to make recommendations about who will be on the board. So it's a way of cutting it out of it. Abbott came in and just, strangely enough, the head of public service recommended Neil Brown, who thinks the ABC should be privatised, and Janet Albrechtsen, who apparently works for The Australian, to be these people, to be the gatekeepers. So there's trouble wherever you look, I suppose.
Thanks for your address. Getting closer to home, to me, one of the most serious attacks on journalists here in Victoria was when Andrew Bolt was sued for defamation when he made a very mild criticism of a magistrate. He didn't call her corrupt or anything like this. She was a bit soft on drug dealers, I think, sort of thing. And she was awarded $400,000, I think. Now, I don't recall at the time that the Journalists Association came out in support of it. There was nothing in the media to mention his support. I mean, he's not everybody's favourite journalist, I know. He's not my favourite journalist either. But it was a pretty dark day, I felt, for freedom of speech in Victoria.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a partial thing on that. Journalists pick and choose their battles. I mean, it is hard to support Andrew Bolt, but
I agree with you there, but
I do agree with you. I think some of the controls on freedom of speech are dangerous. I mean, what I oppose is the reason why these changes were made, to unlock bigotry and Islamophobia and all the rest of it. It would be my humble view to stir up hatred and divide the community so you can be re-elected. That may sound very simplistic, but it's just a general over sort of view that I have of the reason those changes were made. But Bolt has every right to say those things. He's been badly treated by his colleagues. But, sometimes we say in journalism and you say in the union movement that you fight for the highest principles with the worst example. And that's a problem with Bolt. He is the worst example of the highest principles. And so the game didn't get off the ground. And I think it's because journalists also were they're weakened by this never-ending onslaught. As it so happens, the people he wanted to support him were the very people his masters have been trashing. That's Murdoch. They've been trashing the ABC. I mean, it is just extraordinary to read their papers week in, week out. And if you're not in this country and you're somewhere else, and you come back and you wonder if anything really matters in the world except the ABC, according to Murdoch. So that's the problem that he had. So I agree with your assessment. You're quite right.
Thank you.
There's a question up there. I'll just quickly jump in and say, from our point of view, the greatest threat is the defamation laws. It's something that an editor of an organisation that doesn't have deep pockets it's an existential problem. The defamation laws. One mistake will cost hundreds of thousands, which in a bad year would be enough to people don't understand how delicate life is when you have defamation laws like we have. It's quite chilling.
Truth itself is not a defence. Truth is not a defence. What kind of crazy law is this? As a journalist, we pursue the truth. We try to. We sometimes don't like what we find, and we end up with a story that's completely different from the one we set out to do. We're going, we really don't like this, but it's true. But that's not a defence in the court of law, because of an implication that may be made by two truths. So Mr. Smith or whatever went to the bakery, and Mr. Jones went to the gun shop down the road. Now the fact is, the guy was found dead at the bus stop in between. So the implication is that the other guy that went to the gun shop knocked off the guy that went to the bakery. I mean, in simplistic terms, that is how you try to do work in Australia as a journalist. The defamation laws, at least they're now across the board. They're not just state-based. They used to have state-based defamation laws. They were fantastic. So the ABC would be running a story, and then they'd say, we have to now shut out Victoria because this is defamatory in Victoria. Oh no, particularly, by the way, South Australia. I think you guys are slightly better. New South Wales wasn't so bad, but that's what a patchwork quilt it was. But the defamation laws, you're quite right. Another thing to make you think twice about doing your job.
Just got time for one more question.
I'd just like to ask one. I just take issue with you in some ways on the Australian. While I think it has many sins, it also has probably some of the best journalism in Australia in certain areas. But I'd also ask, do you see any sort of positivity returning to the media world in terms of things like, say, almost philanthropic media, the way Guardian Australia has been supported by an Australian businessman, or the compensation, or perhaps even Nick's employer with the Sunday paper? Do you think that has any possibility of...
That's a good point. I mean, there's not enough time to raise all these things in the talk, but firstly, yes, Hedley Thomas, who gave us the Hanif story, and Cameron Stewart. Both of these people are fabulous journalists. They both work for The Australian. Without Hedley Thomas, we would never have known about Hanif. Fabulous stuff. The Australian, you're quite right, has some of the best journalists I've ever worked with and I've ever seen. The problem occurs when what they're doing doesn't fit the matrix of the argument of the campaign that's being run, and then it's impossible to get material told in a different way. How do I know that? Because I used to work there, and I had a story of mine that was killed, and it's one of the reasons I left, because it didn't fit the argument. And what I've proven was that just because of the structure of this particular organisation's constitution, it was impossible to do what the Oz was calling for. And I said, look, here's the constitution, can't do this, can't do that. And they said, find somebody else to say something different. I said, but we know now it's an impossible argument. And they weren't interested. And they put it on this a long time ago, put it on the Spike, which is a bit of metal. They put your stories on there. And it was then that I decided to walk out the door, but I didn't do what I'd done in the past and, sort of just throw a hissy fit and rush off down the pub and say, I've had enough. I waited until I got another job. And so that's what I did. But so to answer your question about the more, what's the model? The Guardian, which has got a trust fund that was set up to avoid taxes back in the 1890s or 1910s or so, it's got enough money now, they say, to last for 10 years. And it does seriously good work. It's not always happy about what I've written in the book, because I don't exactly, I say they're good, what they've done, but they also, they're also a bit flawed, so there are also problems which they don't take too kindly to. But yes, there is some sort of philanthropic support, there is something like that could maybe help make this transition, but certainly we need all the help we can get, and someone to actually come in and give unencumbered money without, through a barrier that doesn't let them have a say in what's said in the papers. It's kind of difficult, but you may get naming rights or something like that.
So if you know anyone, please. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but thank you very much for joining us. Andrew's book, The War on Journalism, is, I understand, available up the top for signing, I hope.
Yeah, only a few copies left.
But thank you very much for coming, and thanks, Andrew Fowler.
Okay, thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks a lot.